top 5 Australian fighters first, because you've been around the scene. So you were the first guy to go in the UFC. Didn't have great success, but we now have guys entering the UFC who are title holders, which is a pretty significant thing, because I remember on that journey for years they were saying, countries like Australia and England will never be title challengers because we don't have wrestling. And that argument seems to have gone out the window these days, where it only seems to be a component. And even watching Chael Sonnen the other day, he was saying that even dominant wrestlers, when they come into MMA, aren't necessarily that dominant as fighters. So quite a lot of guys to look at in there. Who sort of rounds out your top 5?
Well, just before we go into the top 5, obviously a big part of that is the cage. I think that's what makes the difference. So obviously wrestling is still very important. The reason, Bisping still did a lot of wrestling, Alex, Rob, these guys do a lot of wrestling, but what they do is very well integrated into use with the cage. And I think that's if you understand how to use the cage, you can deal with people who have very strong specialties in certain areas if they have not incorporated the use of the cage effectively in their game. And that was a big part of Khabib, is when he first started fighting. If you watch his fights, he mainly shot singles and doubles in the middle and maybe drove to the cage to took them down, but basically worked off singles and doubles. Then he had a couple of tough fights.
So you're quickly getting sprawled on. You've got room to back up is what we're looking at. But if we can move them against something, yeah.
Fighting, but it was extremely tiring for him as well. And then he realized if he could push people to the cage, he could work his body lock. He would still drop down for singles and doubles, but no longer shooting off the cage. So it's not as energy taxing, not as risky, because you're not being opened up to striking. If he missed it, he could then climb back up into the body, back into the body lock, drag and trip them down. If they defended by opening up the legs, he'd pick up the single. And then his game really evolved, and his ability to dominate started to skyrocket, in my opinion, once he understood how to use the cage effectively. If you look at a lot of his last couple of fights, everything was on the cage.
But that's not new though, because when I go back to like 2006, this is exactly how Ant would train. It was, I'm not really worried about striking. I will walk into you as necessary to pin you up against something. And then Absolutely. We're going straight in for that bear hug penetration, and we'll see what comes out of that effectively.
No, it's not. But the difference is you need more than just being able to shell up and walk forward, because people are now getting much better at cutting angles. People are much more aware of the risk of being on the cage. So people now tend to not back up as much, but start to circle off. And so that's what he became very good at, is he understood that when they're off the cage, he needed to be able to draw them in. So he would still shoot for singles and doubles in the open. But then what he would do is, once he made connection, he would then drive to even just with an ankle, he would drive into the cage, because he knew once he got to the cage, he could climb up the body. So the strategy has been around for a while. Obviously, it's just been refined a lot more. And as I said earlier, it's that ability to draw someone into their strength, to think they're in a position to dominate, so you can then drive into your strength.
And
now onto the
It's really interesting that you mentioned that, because I was reading a career breakdown on Cro Cop not too long ago, and they were pointing out the exact opposite fashion. And the argument was, why didn't Cro Cop have success in the UFC? And they were able to nail it. He went from a ring into a cage. And if you watch all of his Pride fights, he's just gradually cutting someone off until he puts them into a corner to unleash those legs. And that didn't happen at all. And then all of a sudden he was, virtually exposed, because once they took that away from him, then they learned to put him on the back foot, which is arguably what Fedor did in their fight, where he couldn't get off initially. Anyway, so top 5 Australian fighters.
Obviously, Volkanovski, absolute legend. He's done fantastic stuff. Obviously, he's the current champion at the moment, and he's been absolutely phenomenal in his performance. And his last fight was absolutely brilliant. I know it was a couple of
You shouldn't
tense
be doing
moments.
that. That's
Yeah,
wrong. That's wrong. How are you getting out of this?
yeah, there's a couple of tense moments in there. But man, he showed the heart and fortitude, the Australian spirit. Don't give up, keep fighting, and he's still the champion because of that. So obviously, he's a big part of it. Before that, Rob Whitaker. Rob, absolutely fantastic. Again, he's one of those people who focuses on his striking, but he understands the use of the cage and the ability to get to the cage, to get up. He uses the cage to kind of circle people into his kicks and punches and at range. And obviously a champion for quite a while, had a lot of difficult situations with illnesses and injuries and things like that. Looking forward to seeing him fight for the belt again. Hopefully he's going to review what happened last time, had come back with a better strategy. I think what happened in his last fight, he just got drawn in a little bit too much.
No, I disagree. I think they were too anxious. I think two of the worst fights that I've ever seen fought was Whitaker versus Adesanya. And when
oh no, I agree. I don't think that was a good fight. I think
but what's his name? Verdun fought Stipe. When you don't think that you can counter, they just effectively ran at them and got countered flush in the open in the middle of their fight. I think Whitaker has to come back a little bit more relaxed and kind of force Adesanya into his space and see if he can sort something out from there.
Yeah, look, it's always a difficult situation because Rob is very much a counter fighter, and Izzy is an even more established counter fighter. Like he's way more patient. He'd be willing to sit back a lot more, because if he can land a couple of shots and win on points, he's not going to take the risk. I think with Rob, he's the counter fighter, and I think he was aware that Izzy was a counter fighter, and he thought the best way would be to, I'm assuming, again, I have no idea, was maybe to try and overwhelm him, not give him the opportunity to get set. But I think that just literally played right into Izzy's game. So
yeah, it
like
came
you said,
off as nervousness to me, the same way that Verdun tried to trace Stipe and just crossed him. Perhaps I'm wrong about that, but when someone gets too anxious and too overburdened, so they just kind of run at you.
Yeah. So obviously, man, we've got we've had a lot of great fighters over the years. Some of the old school names like George Soteropoulos, Ross Pearson, even though he fought out of the UK.
By. Yeah.
He now fights out of the Central Coast. Some of those old school names. Can't forget the ladies. We've got Jessie Jess fighting at the moment. She's doing quite well. She's obviously come off injury recently. I think she's been off for 12 months or so with a knee reconstruction. I think she could do some big things. Who else? Anderson. Having a mental blank on
Megan Anderson.
name.
We got Beck Rawlings, the female fighters that I can think of from that space.
Well, Megan's fought for the belt and stuff, so she's a talented 145er. I think she's got to do a little bit more work on certain areas of a game to kind of round it out, and I think we've seen that starting to happen in the last couple of fights. So yeah, we've got a few guys, obviously. A few new guys kind of making appearances in the UFC. We'll see how they go. We've had some ups and downs. Obviously, all-time great. We can't ignore Mark Hunt. The guy's an absolute legend. We love Mark Hunt's walk-off KOs for years.
He's apparently living up here too these days.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Yeah. And obviously, bouncing off Mark Hunt, you've got Tai Tuivasa, who's still fighting. He's a kid with a lot of talent. I think he can do big things in the division. I just think, again, he needs he's got that one area he's very good at. He just needs to be able to survive in the other areas, to draw people into being able to take them back into his game. So there's obviously a couple of areas he kind of struggles with. I think, like Mark Hunt, has very good double leg defense, but I think both those guys struggle a little bit with the single leg. And again, I think that's where Stipe worked that out with Hunt, that Hunt's sprawl was phenomenal. You shoot a double on him, but you pick up one leg, he was literally just falling over. And I think Ty is a little bit, not to the same degree, but I think needs to work on a few other areas of his takedown defense. Obviously, Tyson Pedro, haven't seen him for a while. I'm kind of looking forward to seeing him back. He had a few injuries. Obviously, he shot up very quickly in the division, was doing some great things, had a couple of tough fights, which set him back
everybody then. I think we're up to 9 now.
Oh.
Very complimentary of everybody.
We've got a lot of great talent outside of, the top 2, our title holders. Everyone's, I didn't want to ignore the guys who kind of helped build our history. It's important to recognize the work they did, and obviously the new guys, which are still in there and fighting, but haven't quite hit the top of their game. So, and again, there's still a lot more people that deserve recognition or doing great things in the sport. But we'll leave it at that.
All right, and I guess before we wrap up, then a much more acute question then: who do you reckon are the top 5 MMA guys of all time in your opinion? Then,
obviously,
so you got 5.
5. All right, I'll do it. I'll start with one of my favorites, is Anderson Silva.
So he fits in at number 5 or number 1, you reckon?
Don't tell me I've got to put him in order.
Oh, well, what's the point of having a fight if there's not a winner, right? What are we watching here?
I just want to give my top 5. I shouldn't have to put them in one.
Out of all the sports that you could pick for shouldn't we all just get along?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just be friends and fight each other for fun. GSP, obviously, super dominant in his time.
So I got the same ones as you so far.
Fedor, you can't ignore what Fedor did in Pride. Absolutely phenomenal. I've got Khabib, obviously, in there.
Don't have Khabib in there.
I think honestly, he's a tough one. I think because he was so dominant for when he was in there, but I don't think he was in the sport at the highest level for long enough. But you just can't ignore what he did while he was in there, and obviously Mighty Mouse as well.
Yeah, I got DJ as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Just the amount of title challenges, his dominance in the division. Now there are a lot of
That's 5.
That's a lot of other great fighters. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm not going to go into any others. They're probably my top 5. So which one? Obviously, you didn't have Khabib. Which was the other one that you had?
Well, Jon Jones was my number 1. Despite all,
he was actually in my list as well.
So the way that I would just
light heavyweight, but since you limited it to 5, I don't know. See, I think he has the potential to be one of the all-time greatest if he ever makes it into the heavyweight division.
Well, I guess I think the thing is that, as you said, so the argument against Khabib is that he wasn't in there long enough. I think oftentimes on the rise up, he wasn't facing the top tier competition that some of the other guys. Of course, he's the only guy that's undefeated. But I don't hold it against guys that stay in too long so much. So again, if we talk about Anderson or Fedor, we know that they went on a long skid. But I think arguably for fighters, you kind of have to look at a key 5-year period and who they were fighting.
Yeah, their prime period.
Yeah. And the other thing is, I think, if we look at MMA as a sport, it's one of the only sports that we can participate where you have the option to end the game early if you're that dominant. And so if you can knock someone out or submit them, and you're only 30 seconds in to what's supposed to be a 25-minute bout, I think that counts for something. So perhaps he's not there yet, but I think Ngannou might very well be. If you have 15 fights and your total cage time is 17 minutes, I think that gives you a pretty good argument for saying that you're the best fighter of all time.
Oh, look, Ngannou definitely has the potential to be one of the all-time greats. Obviously, there was a couple of fights in there that he lost, but I think they made him better for it. I think he's now come out. But I'm interested to see how he does against Cyril Gain. Obviously, coming up against another big striker who's probably not as aggressive, but probably more skilled. Yeah, I think we need a few more fights, a couple of title defenses before we even start talking about him in that all-time greats. And as you said, Khabib is one of the enigmas that I struggle with, because as I said, when he did face the best, even if it was for a short time, he was dominant. He finished them all. You know, he finished all the top guys. I really would have liked to have seen, you know, another year or two at least, you know, maybe another.
And that's why I think he left too. And the same thing, like I got a lot more respect for GSP for leaving for multiple years and then coming back in than just having, you know, to be able to walk in and say, yeah, I'll fight Bisping and do it with that long of layoff at a higher weight, I think speaks arguably as good to the record before it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, and as I said, with Jon Jones, it's particularly interesting because he was so dominant until he got to a point where I think I heard an interview where he said it was too easy to win by beating them at my strength. And that's why he fights people at their strengths. And until you're able to kind of look back at what he did and how he did it, you can't really appreciate what he's done. Because again, people look at how hard the fights were, not how they were done. And I think that's, if you can go back and kind of look at his fights and look at how he fights, and again, the rematches are what is so telling to me. They kind of show that what he was doing was trying to beat them at them. If that kind of makes sense.
Well, it does. But I also heard the rumors that he would only train like 3 days a week for some of these fights. Like I heard he's one of those guys that he knows he's that good, doesn't even really train and just shows up on the night.
And he was even admitting he was on coke binges.
Yes.
In the lead up, like, I mean, and again, that comes down to that head case thing. And again, you know, he's a head case. He doesn't feel like he needs to train. He feels he's so good that he can beat them at their own game, that he can do coke binges. And as he said, it was an excuse because he would do the coke binges because he felt he was so good, but he was also putting in an excuse in the back of his mind that if he lost, it wasn't because he wasn't the better fighter, because it was the coke binge.
Yeah, fair enough.
So he was, and again, it's that fragile ego where he has to believe he's the best. He believes he's the best, but part of him doubts it. So he sets up a contingency plan where he's got an excuse if he doesn't win. And I think that's why he does a lot of some of the stupid stuff. As I said, it's sadly that being a head case outside of the cage is also affecting how he's going to be remembered and what he does in the cage as well. And again, that's one of the reasons I like DJ so much, and why I had to put him in was because, you know, he just, every fight evolved. He brought something different to the game. He put people at his strengths, at their strength. He did whatever was necessary. Obviously, that fantastic run in his division where he just absolutely dominated for so long. And even that fight he lost before leaving the UFC, I don't actually think he lost. I actually thought he won.
It was split again, wasn't it, with Cejudo before he left?
Yeah. Cejudo. Well, yeah, he finished Cejudo in their first match and then obviously gets the split on his loss. And I personally thought he won that match. I thought he did enough.
But he's gone down twice in one now. I think he's lost two fights. So I have that right in the last year and a bit. I have to go back.
I know he's lost one. I'm not sure if he's lost two.
Yeah.
But again, that's one of the issues I have with one as well, is because it's the promoter who's the commission. I have issues with, because I've heard stories. Now, again, they're just stories, they're rumors. But sometimes when you look at the size discrepancy on some of the athletes, because they've obviously got the weight cutting rule where you can't be dehydrated, and whereas we're seeing some fighters with massive size discrepancies. And if you've got that weight cut rule, how is that discrepancy so much? Unless people are not being treated equally. And again, as I said, commissions, when you don't have an external commission in charge of ensuring all the rules are being followed, how can you trust the rules are being followed? I mean, you know, a promoter's job is to sell fights and to build champions. It's not to help anyone. It's to promote their business. And if they feel a local champion is going to do better for them than an international one, well, what are they willing to do that if it means it's going to be greater revenue?
True.
I'm not saying they are. You know, they maybe are that, but again, you really.
But you're not saying they're not either.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All
right.
Fair enough. Interesting situation. So because there's been a couple of guys who've done so in the in one, and you could say that maybe the UFC skill level isn't as high as people believe it is. I don't think that's the case. I do think the guys at the top are really at the top across the planet. I do think there's a lot of talent at various levels that come into the show, not necessarily all at the highest level, but that they are generally filtered out before they get to anywhere where they're challenging for titles anyway. So,
well, I will say I'm getting very, very excited about the Bellator roster as it continues to develop. I think they're doing a very good job of bringing in international fighters. I really like it. The really competitive matches.
Well, they've been smart. They brought in UFC guys with name value to help build it, but then they're also seeking their own talent from outside the UFC to try and build some more names. And I will say it was nice seeing Fedor win in Russia as well. So that was
pretty fast for 45. Pretty fast hands for 45.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, I think hopefully we've covered everything. Hopefully people listening aren't bored and haven't tuned out by now.
I hope not. They're going to think you're a COVID doctor after the first 45 minutes of this talk, I think. So I'll have to cut this up.
I was a doctor of love. I'm now a doctor of infection.
Fair enough. Well, it was good to speak, and maybe I'll even run into you again sometime down the road.
No problem. Sounds good. Maybe we can do a couple of months or a year or so. We'll do a follow-up and see where everything's going.
Happy to. All right, awesome. Good to speak, King.
Always a pleasure. Good to be the king. Thanks for having me on.
All the best. Thanks very much. Cheers.